The restaurant was called Embers. On this December evening, 3 days before Christmas, its windows glowed amber against the falling snow outside, casting warm light onto the sidewalk where holiday shoppers hurried past with bags of wrapped presents. Inside, the air smelled of roasted meat and expensive wine, and soft Christmas carols drifted from hidden speakers throughout the candlelit dining room. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the tables were draped in white linen that probably cost more to clean than Marcus Webb earned in an hour. He arrived wearing his only sport coat, the one he reserved for parent-teacher conferences and job interviews, feeling immediately out of place among the well-dressed couples and business executives who populated the other tables. He waited at a table set for two beneath garlands of pine and silver bells, checking his phone every few minutes with growing unease. 40 minutes passed, then 50. The messages he sent went unanswered, disappearing into a digital void that offered no explanation or comfort. But the food kept coming in dishes. He never ordered bottles of wine. He never requested each one placed before him by servers who smiled professionally and said nothing about the empty chair across from him. When Marcus finally stood to leave, his face burning with a mixture of humiliation and confusion, the manager appeared with a bill that made his stomach drop. $873. The number seemed to pulse on the paper, mocking everything he thought he knew about this evening. Before he could speak, before he could stammer out some inadequate explanation or plea for mercy, a woman's voice cut through the soft holiday music from somewhere behind him. "Put that on my account, and we need to talk about how this happened." Marcus turned toward the voice, his face burning with shame and confusion. The woman was already on her feet, moving with quiet authority across the candlelit dining room. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, except for a thin gold watch, and her expression revealed nothing as she approached the tense scene unfolding near his table. "I appreciate the offer, sir," Marcus said, his voice tight with embarrassment, "but I can't accept that kind of help from a complete stranger. I don't even know you." The woman didn't argue or try to reassure him with empty platitudes. She simply looked at him with steady gray eyes and said, "You didn't order this food, you weren't told the prices, and you've been sitting here for nearly an hour waiting for someone who clearly never intended to show up. What happened to you tonight wasn't your fault, and it shouldn't cost you money you probably can't afford to lose." The manager, a slender man in his 50s with silver hair swept back from his forehead, shifted uncomfortably beside them. "Ma'am, our policy requires that all orders placed at a table be settled by the party occupying that table. I'm sure you understand that we can't simply—" "I'm aware of your policy," she interrupted, her tone measured but carrying an edge that made the manager stop mid-sentence. "I'm also aware that your staff seated this gentleman at a table with a prearranged order without confirming his identity or explaining the arrangement. That's not standard procedure. That's negligence. And it's exactly the kind of negligence that creates serious liability for this establishment." Marcus watched the exchange in silence, his hands still gripping the back of his chair. Part of him wanted to walk away, to disappear into the cold December night and pretend none of this had ever happened. The humiliation was already burning in his chest, and having this stranger witness it only made everything worse. But another part of him, the part that had spent 4 years learning to swallow his pride for the sake of his daughter, recognized something in this woman's intervention. She wasn't trying to rescue him out of pity or condescension. She was correcting something she found genuinely unacceptable, as though injustice itself offended her sensibilities. The manager's expression flickered between professional composure and barely concealed annoyance. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint about our procedures, I can certainly provide you with the appropriate contact information. What I'd like is for you to apologize to this man, quietly, sincerely, and then process the payment I've offered without making any record of his name or his presence here tonight. Can you do that?" A long pause followed her words. Marcus could hear the soft clinking of silverware from distant tables, the murmur of conversations that had nothing to do with him, and underneath it all, Christmas carols about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Finally, the manager turned to face Marcus directly. "Sir, I apologize for any confusion this evening. We'll handle the bill exactly as the lady has requested." Marcus nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. The woman watched until the manager retreated toward the kitchen, then turned her attention back to Marcus. Her expression softened slightly, though it remained guarded. "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question, but it caught him completely off guard. In the 4 years since his wife Emily had passed away from cancer, since he'd taken over sole responsibility for raising their daughter Lily, no one had asked him that question and actually seemed to want an honest answer. Friends asked out of obligation, coworkers asked out of routine. But this stranger asked as though she genuinely wanted to know. I don't know, he admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. This whole night has been something I can't quite process. I thought I was meeting someone. Someone I'd been talking to for weeks, and instead I got this. A con, she said plainly. A deliberate scheme designed to extract money from you through embarrassment and confusion. Someone used a dating app to lure you here, arranged an expensive meal under your reservation without your knowledge, and planned to leave you holding a bill you couldn't possibly have expected. You're not the first person this has happened to, and you won't be the last unless something changes. Marcus felt those words settle into his chest like stones. A con, a scheme. He thought about the profile photo of the woman he had been messaging for 2 weeks. Her warm smile and kind eyes, the way she'd laughed at his self-deprecating jokes about being a single dad who couldn't cook anything more complicated than grilled cheese sandwiches. He thought about the hope he'd allowed himself to feel, the careful optimism that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to try again. Why would someone do this? Because they can, she said simply. Because this restaurant has a reputation for discretion, and because men who come here alone, hoping to impress someone they've never met, rarely make a scene when things go wrong. They pay the bill, swallow their shame, and never talk about it again. He looked at her directly for the first time, really studying her face. No pity in her expression, no condescension or judgment, just a kind of clear-eyed recognition of the facts as they existed. Thank you, he said finally, for stepping in like that. You really didn't have to get involved. No, she agreed, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I didn't, but I wanted to. She paused, then gestured toward the table where he'd been sitting. The food is already made. It would be a shame to let it go to waste, and I suspect you could use a decent meal that doesn't come with any strings attached. The woman returned to her own table, a corner spot with a clear view of the entrance, and sat down gracefully. She left the seat across from her empty, an invitation, not a command. Marcus stood there weighing his options. He could leave now, walk out into the cold December night, and try to forget any of this had happened. That was the safe choice, the choice that protected what remained of his dignity. But something made him stay. Maybe the genuine kindness he'd seen in her intervention. Maybe simple loneliness. Or maybe something Lily had said 3 months ago when she found him eating leftover macaroni and cheese over the kitchen sink at 11 o'clock at night. Dad, she'd asked with the devastating honesty only a 7-year-old can muster. Are you lonely? He'd lied to her, then told her he was fine. But they both knew the truth. He sat down across from the stranger who had just paid $800 to spare him from humiliation. She poured water into his glass without comment. I recommend the risotto. It's probably the only thing on this menu that's actually worth what they charge for it. Despite everything, Marcus felt the corner of his mouth twitch. I thought the food was already ordered. It was, but you can still enjoy it without pretending it's worth $800. Outside the frost-covered windows, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. Thick flakes drifting down through the glow of Christmas lights strung along the street. Inside the restaurant hummed with quiet conversations, people celebrating the holiday season, with family and friends unaware of the small drama that had just unfolded. The conversation that followed was careful, circling around the obvious pain points without landing directly on them. She asked what Marcus did for work, and he found himself telling her about his job at the community center in Portland, how he spent his days coaching youth basketball for kids who reminded him of himself at that age, running after-school programs for families who couldn't afford private childcare, filling out grant applications that never seemed to lead anywhere meaningful. She asked about his commute, and he described the 20-minute drive through downtown, past old brick buildings, slowly being converted into expensive loft apartments he would never be able to afford. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did offer something about herself, it was measured and careful. She mentioned traveling frequently for work, though she didn't specify what that work entailed. She described a childhood spent in New England winters filled with deep snow and long silences that taught her to appreciate solitude. She said nothing concrete about what she actually did for a living. Marcus found himself relaxing despite the strangeness. There was something grounding about her presence, a steadiness that made him feel less like a man who had just been publicly humiliated and more like someone simply sharing a meal with an interesting new acquaintance. Can I ask you something? He said, eventually setting down his fork. You can ask. I might not answer. Why were you eating alone tonight? A place like this 3 days before Christmas. Most people come with family or dates. I was waiting, she said simply, for the right moment to see something clearly. Marcus didn't fully understand what that meant, but he sensed it was all the answer he was going to get tonight. So instead of pushing further, he offered something of his own. I haven't done this in a long time, he admitted. The dating thing. My wife passed 4 years ago. Lily, our daughter, she's 7 now. She's been asking questions I don't have good answers for. Last month, she wanted to know why I don't have any friends who aren't also her friends. He laughed softly, but there was no real humor in the sound. Kids have a way of pointing out the things you're trying hard not to notice about yourself. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition or perhaps understanding. That's a brave thing, she said quietly. Trying again. Most people find reasons to stay comfortable in their loneliness. Is that what you did? Stay comfortable. The question came out before Marcus could stop himself, more personal than he had any right to ask a stranger. For a while, yes, she said after a moment. After my father died, I buried myself in work and told myself it was responsibility. But comfort has a way of becoming its own kind of trap. Before Marcus could respond, a waiter appeared and murmured something in her ear. Whatever he said changed her posture immediately. She straightened in her chair, her jaw tightening. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes. The waiter retreated. Everything okay? Marcus asked, recognizing the shift in her attention. A work matter, nothing that can't wait a few more minutes. But Marcus could see the truth in the set of her shoulders, the way part of her had already moved on. He recognized that look because he'd worn it himself countless times. You should go, he said. Really, you've done more than enough for me tonight. She studied his face for a longer moment. Then she reached into her bag and produced a simple white business card, which she placed face down on the tablecloth between them. If anything else comes of tonight, if anyone contacts you, or if you notice suspicious charges, call that number. Someone will help. Marcus picked up the card, but didn't turn it over. Will I see you again? The question surprised them both. Perhaps, she said finally. Portland isn't as big as it pretends to be. She gathered her coat and walked toward a back door Marcus hadn't noticed before, one that clearly led somewhere other than the main entrance. Only after she had disappeared through that door did Marcus turn over the business card. The name printed on it was Claire Ashford in elegant serif type. Below that, in smaller letters, Chief Executive Officer, Ashford Hospitality Group. Marcus stared at those words, feeling the evening rearrange itself in his mind. Ashford Hospitality Group. He'd seen that name on hotel chains, on brass plaques outside expensive restaurants. The woman who paid his bill, who listened to him talk about his dead wife and lonely daughter, wasn't just some random customer. She owned this restaurant. She owned an entire hospitality empire. Everything suddenly felt different. The careful questions she had asked, how she knew exactly how the scam worked before he'd explained anything. Of course she knew. This was her business, her staff, her responsibility. Marcus stood abruptly, accidentally knocking his water glass. A busboy materialized to clean the spill. Marcus grabbed his coat and headed for the exit. The December air hit him like a physical blow, sharp and cold. Snow was falling heavily now, dusting parked cars and the Christmas wreaths on every lamppost. He stood on the sidewalk, breath forming clouds, trying to make sense of what just happened. A CEO, a billionaire probably. She had personally intervened in his humiliation, shared a meal with him, given him her card. Why would someone like that bother with someone like him? The questions multiplied as Marcus walked to his car, a 12-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked intermittently. By the time he pulled into his driveway 25 minutes later, passing houses decorated with twinkling lights, he still had no answers. Mrs. Patterson was sitting in his living room when he came in, knitting needles clicking steadily. How was your big date? Interesting, Marcus said. Lily give you any trouble? Went down around 8:30. She wanted to wait up for you. Marcus thanked her, paid the $20, and watched her shuffle to her own house next door. Then he climbed the stairs to his daughter's bedroom and pushed open the door. Lily was curled on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant she'd had since infancy. A paper snowflake she'd made at school hung in the window, casting delicate shadows on the wall. Marcus sat on the edge of her mattress and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. Hey, Dad, she murmured, not quite awake. Hey, sweetheart, go back to sleep. Did you make a friend? The question cut through him. Such a simple thing to ask. She just wanted her father to be happy. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe, we'll see. The next evening found Marcus back at the community center, running basketball drills with middle schoolers. It was mindless work in the best sense, the squeak of sneakers on the gym floor, the echo of bouncing balls, the shouts and laughter of kids who hadn't yet learned to be disappointed by life. But his mind kept drifting back to Claire Ashford. He'd spent his lunch break researching her. The internet had plenty to say. 38 years old, only child of restaurant magnate Harold Ashford, who had built a modest Portland steakhouse into a regional empire before his death 6 years ago. Claire had taken over the family business at 32 and expanded it aggressively, acquiring competitors, opening new locations, pushing into the hotel sector. The articles painted a complicated picture. Some praised her as a visionary, others described her as ruthless. There were mentions of lawsuits settled out of court of former partners who spoke anonymously about feeling betrayed, but there were also profiles highlighting her charitable work, her investments in local food banks, her quiet funding of scholarships for hospitality students. Marcus couldn't reconcile all these different versions with the woman who had asked about his daily commute. After practice ended and the last kids were picked up, Marcus stayed behind to lock up. He was reaching for the alarm panel when his phone buzzed. Unknown number, Mr. Webb. This is Claire Ashford. I learned something today about what happened to you, and I believe you deserve to know the full truth. If you're willing, and I'd like to meet again. Somewhere public. Marcus typed back when and where. They met the next afternoon at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, windows decorated with painted snowflakes. Claire was already there, looking different in daylight, less polished. Shadows under her eyes, hair in a simple ponytail. Thank you for coming, she said as Marcus settled into the chair across from her. I know this must seem strange. Strange is one word for it. A barista took his order, black coffee. Neither spoke until it arrived. I owe you an explanation, Claire said finally. What happened to you wasn't random. It was part of a deliberate pattern that's been happening in my restaurants for over a year. A pattern I've been trying to expose and eliminate for months. What kind of pattern? Someone inside my organization has been running a systematic fraud operation. They identify targets through dating apps, usually single men, widowers or divorcees, people who are actively trying to rebuild their romantic lives. They create fictional personas designed to appeal to specific vulnerabilities. They establish relationships over weeks, building trust. Then they arrange to meet at one of my restaurants where expensive meals have been pre-ordered under the target's reservation. And they don't show up, Marcus said flatly, leaving the guy with a bill he can't afford. Exactly. The scheme exploits both the restaurant's reputation for discretion and the victim's own embarrassment. No one wanted to admit they'd been fooled, so they paid quietly. You said someone inside your organization. You know who it is? His name is Richard Vance, my head of operations for 15 years, longer than I've been running things. My father hired him, trusted him completely. He has access to everything: reservation systems, staffing schedules, financial records. And he has a network of people throughout the organization who are loyal to him. Have you confronted him? Not yet. I need more evidence. Enough to take to the board, enough to present to law enforcement. She leaned forward. That's why I wanted to see you. I think you might be able to help. Help how? The people running this scheme researched their targets extensively. The woman who contacted you wasn't real. She was a carefully constructed fiction built from data about your life. That data still exists somewhere in Richard's files. Your employment history, your financial situation, maybe even information about your wife, your daughter. His jaw tightened at the mention of his family. If we can access those files, we prove the pattern. We identify other victims. We build a case that Richard can't deny. And you need me because you're a victim who's willing to talk, because you have standing to file a formal complaint, and because your story, a single father, a widower, a man who was simply trying to find connection after loss, that's exactly the kind of story that will make a jury pay attention. Marcus sat back, processing what she was proposing. She wasn't just asking him to help expose fraud. She was asking him to become a symbol, a face, a narrative. I'm not a crusader, Ms. Ashford. I'm not an activist. I'm just a guy who coaches basketball and tries to convince his daughter that vegetables aren't poison. I know, Claire said. That's exactly why you matter. Because you're not someone with an agenda. You're just a person to whom something wrong happened. Silence stretched between them. Outside, holiday shoppers hurried past. I need to think about it, Marcus said finally. Of course. Claire slid a manila folder across the table. But before you decide, I want you to see what we're dealing with. Marcus opened the folder. First page, a photograph of a man in his mid-40s, confident smile. Richard Vance. Second page, printed emails discussing target acquisition and revenue optimization. Clinical language about human beings, about victims. Third page, a spreadsheet. Names, dates, amounts. Dozens of entries spanning 18 months. At the bottom, a total that made his head spin. $432,000. He closed the folder. His hands were trembling. Why show me this? Because you deserve to know what you almost became part of. And because I want you to understand that this isn't about my reputation or my company's bottom line. It's about people. Real people who were hurt because someone decided their loneliness was an opportunity to exploit. For the first time, Marcus saw something genuinely vulnerable in her expression. Not weakness, something raw. Accountability she couldn't delegate. I'll think about it, he said. I need to figure out what this would mean for my life, for Lily's life. I understand, and Mr. Webb, whatever you decide what happened to you matters to me. Not as a CEO protecting her business, as a person who should have seen this sooner. 3 days passed. Christmas Eve arrived with gentle snowfall and the smell of pine needles from the small tree Marcus had put up. He still hadn't decided. The folder sat on his kitchen table like an accusation unopened since the coffee shop. That night, after Lily was finally asleep, her stocking hung by the fireplace, and cookies left for Santa. Marcus called his brother David in Seattle. "Let me make sure I understand," David said after hearing everything. "A billionaire CEO wants you to be the public face of a lawsuit against her own employee, and you're hesitating because you think you're being used. Because something feels off, like there's more she's not telling me." Mark, that's what lawyers and executives do. They use people's stories to build cases. That doesn't make the stories less true. But she's not just some lawyer. She's the CEO of the company that let this happen. You think she's trying to rehabilitate her image? Marcus didn't answer immediately. "I can't figure out what she really wants," he admitted. "Maybe exactly what she says, to stop the fraud." "Then why does she need me? She has the evidence. She has the resources." "Because victims have power that corporations don't. A face makes it real." David paused. "Look, if your gut says something's off, listen. My gut thought that dating profile was real." David laughed. "Fair point. What's the worst case if you say yes? My name gets dragged through media. Lily finds out her dad was tricked by a dating scam. Best case, I help expose something real. Prevent others from going through what I went through. Is that what you want?" Marcus looked at Christmas lights blinking on Mrs. Patterson's porch. "I want what happened to mean something, not just random bad luck." "Then maybe that's your answer." On December 26, wrapping paper still scattered across his living room floor, Marcus called Claire and told her he was in. 2 weeks later, Marcus sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor of Ashford Hospitality headquarters. Lawyers and PR specialists surrounded him. They were preparing for the board meeting where Claire would present her evidence against Richard Vance. Marcus was supposed to give a 5-minute statement. The lawyers had coached him until the words lost meaning. Something felt wrong. It had started the day before when he overheard 2 executives talking in the hallway. "Ashford's really going all in on this," one said. "Think she actually cares about the victims, or is this just damage control? Does it matter either way Vance is done? She gets to look like the hero who cleaned house." Those words lodged in his mind. Now sitting in the conference room, questions multiplied. Why had Claire been at Embers that night? She claimed she received an anonymous tip, but she'd been investigating for months. If she already knew about the fraud, why need a tip? More importantly, why had she chosen him? Dozens of victims on that spreadsheet. She had intervened only for Marcus Webb, sat with him, given him her card, made him the centerpiece. Was it because his story was compelling? Or because he was particularly vulnerable? A single father with limited resources, someone who would ask fewer questions. The conference room door opened. Claire entered in a dark blue suit. 30 minutes before the board convenes, she announced. "Any final questions?" Marcus looked around at the professionals paid to make Claire look good. "Actually, yes," he said, and the sharpness in his voice made heads turn. "About the night we met. You said you received an anonymous tip, but you'd been investigating for months. If you already knew about the scheme, why did you need a tip?" Silence fell over the room. "The tip provided specific details," Claire said carefully. "A date, a time, a method. It confirmed things I suspected but couldn't prove. And you just happened to be available. No other commitments 3 days before Christmas. I made myself available. This was important. Important enough to sit down and have dinner with one of the victims, to share personal information, to make me feel like we had some kind of connection." The PR director started to speak, but Claire raised her hand. "If what you're asking is whether my intervention was genuine, the answer is yes. I didn't know who you were when I walked into that restaurant. And that's why you're putting me in front of your board, because I'm a person, not just a name. Your story illustrates what's been happening in a way that numbers can't. My story matters to your case, but do I matter or am I just another asset?" Silence stretched unbearably. Then Claire stood. "Everyone out. I need to speak with Mr. Webb alone." The lawyers protested. She silenced them with a look. Within 30 seconds, the conference room was empty. Claire moved to the chair directly across from Marcus. "You're right to question my motives," she said quietly. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." "About what?" "About why I chose you." She folded her hands on the table. "When I received that anonymous tip, it didn't just contain general information. It included a list of upcoming targets. Your name was on that list. I knew who you were before you walked into Embers." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "You knew my name. Your situation, your vulnerabilities. The same information Richard's people had gathered. I made a decision to intervene specifically in your case." "Why?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "Because of your daughter, Lily." Marcus felt the room tilt. "The dossier on you included information about her. her school, her schedule details that had no legitimate purpose. And at the bottom, there was a note about contingency measures, steps to take if you resisted paying the bill. What kind of steps? Threats, implied threats about contacting Child Protective Services, suggesting you were an unfit parent who frequented expensive restaurants while neglecting responsibilities. It was leverage, insurance to make sure victims stayed quiet. Nausea rose so quickly Marcus had to grip the table. They were going to threaten my daughter. They never got the chance. I made sure of that. But yes, that was Richard's playbook. Her voice was steady, but Marcus could see the tension in her jaw. When I read that dossier, something broke in me. I have no children of my own. I've made choices that prioritize career over everything. But the idea that someone could weaponize a 7-year-old girl who just wants her father to be happy. She shook her head. I couldn't let that stand. Marcus released the table. His hands were trembling. So your intervention wasn't about me, it was about her. It was about both of you. Richard saw your love for your daughter as a vulnerability to exploit. I saw it as something worth protecting. You could have told me this from the beginning. I was afraid that if you knew how much I knew about you, you would never trust me. And I needed your trust. Not just for the case, she paused, for reasons I don't entirely understand myself. The clock on the wall ticks steadily. The board meeting starts in 15 minutes, Claire said. You can still walk away. And the case against Vance. We have other evidence. Your absence would hurt, but it wouldn't be fatal. Marcus thought about the spreadsheet. All those names, he thought about other children whose fathers might be destroyed by this scheme. I'll stay, he said finally. I'll give my statement. But when this is over, you and I are going to have a longer conversation about what honesty actually means. Something flickered across Claire's face. Relief, maybe something else. That's fair. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. Marcus delivered his statement as rehearsed, describing the night at Embers. The waiting, the confusion, the bill. He didn't mention the dossier or the threats against Lily. By the time the vote was taken, he was exhausted. But the vote went in Claire's favor. Richard Vance was immediately suspended pending investigation. The board authorized an external audit. A victim compensation fund was established. In the weeks that followed, the story unfolded. Local news first, then national outlets. Claire gave interviews, her message consistent. This happened under my watch, and I take responsibility. Marcus declined all interview requests. He'd done what he came to do. Spring arrived slowly in Portland. The Christmas decorations came down, replaced by cherry blossoms. On a Saturday afternoon in early April, Marcus took Lily to a park near their house. His phone buzzed. Claire, can we talk in person? They met at the same Pearl District coffee shop. The painted snowflakes were gone from the windows, replaced by paper flowers. The investigation is complete, Claire said. Richard has been charged with wire fraud, conspiracy, and theft. He'll spend years in prison. Good. The compensation fund has contacted everyone on the spreadsheet. 43 people. Most didn't know they'd been deliberately scammed. They thought they'd simply made poor choices. How much did they lose? Over $400,000 collectively. One man lost $12,000, his mother's medical bills. Marcus thought about his own $800. I'm sorry for how hard I was on you in the conference room. Don't apologize, you were right. I had been manipulating the situation even for good reasons. She set down her tea. Which brings me to why I wanted to see you. I have a proposition. Wariness rose in his chest. Not the kind you're imagining. She smiled. The compensation fund needs a board of trustees, people to oversee how money is distributed, to make sure we're actually helping, rather than just looking virtuous. I want you to be one of those trustees. You want me on your board? I want you to consider it. Small honorarium, mostly about integrity. I'd need to think about it. Talk to Lily. Of course. She handed him a smaller folder. Information about the fund. Take your time. Can I ask you something? Always. What happens now for you, I mean? Claire considered the question. Honestly, I don't know. For 6 months, everything was about this. Fixing what went wrong. Now I need to figure it out who I am when I'm not in crisis mode. That sounds healthy. It sounds terrifying. She laughed softly. But maybe that's the point. They talked for another hour. Marcus told her about Lily's ballet progress, the grant he'd secured for the summer program. Claire talked about her childhood, about her demanding father and quiet mother. By the time they said goodbye, afternoon had faded to evening. 2 months later, Marcus accepted the position on the board. A year passed, marked by seasons that seemed to move differently now that Marcus had somewhere to be besides work and home, someone to talk to besides his daughter and his elderly neighbor. The snow that had fallen the night he met Claire melted into spring rain, which gave way to summer sunshine, which faded into autumn leaves that carpeted the sidewalks outside the coffee shop where they met every few weeks. The board meetings took Marcus downtown monthly, where he sat at polished tables with lawyers and executives and argued passionately for the interests of people who would never set foot in rooms like those. People like him, people who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford decent childcare, people who had been targeted because their loneliness made them vulnerable. To his own surprise, he was good at it. His years at the community center had taught him how to translate bureaucratic language into human terms, how to cut through jargon and euphemism to get at what actually mattered. The lawyers learned to respect him. The executives learned to listen. Lily turned 8, then 9. She joined a robotics club at school and came home talking about circuits and coding languages in ways that made Marcus feel simultaneously proud and completely outdated. She stopped asking whether her father was lonely. Instead, she started asking when she was going to meet his friend Claire, the one he was always texting, the one whose name made him smile when it appeared on his phone. Marcus didn't have a good answer for that question. He and Claire continued to see each other throughout those months, their meetings evolving from careful scheduled appointments into something more natural and unplanned. Coffee became lunch, lunch became dinner, dinner became long walks through Portland's parks, conversations that stretched for hours and covered everything from childhood memories to fears about the future. They talked about work and family and the strange, unlikely path that had brought them together. They talked about loss and loneliness and what it meant to try again after everything had fallen apart. But neither of them named what they were building, neither willing to be the first to acknowledge that this had become something neither had expected. Trust Marcus had learned through 4 years of raising a daughter alone through one terrible night in a restaurant. And everything that followed was something earned over time. It couldn't be rushed or demanded or assumed. It had to be demonstrated day after day, choice after choice, until it became as natural as breathing. On a Thursday evening in late September, with the first hints of autumn coloring, the trees outside Marcus was walking to his car after a board meeting when Claire caught up with him in the parking garage. "Got a minute? Everything okay?" "Everything's fine. There's something I've wanted to say for a while, and I keep finding reasons not to, so I'm just going to say it." Marcus waited. "That night at Embers, when I asked if you were all right, I wasn't just being polite. I was recognizing something in you. A loneliness I understood even though our lives looked completely different. I remember. What I didn't tell you is that I went home that night and couldn't sleep. Not because of the case or Richard or any business concerns. Because of you. Because you were the first person in years who looked at me like a human being instead of a title." His heart accelerated. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "The power dynamics are complicated. You have Lily to think about. Trust takes time." She took a breath. "But I needed you to know that whatever this is, friendship or partnership or something else, it matters to me. You matter to me. Not as a witness or a case study, as Marcus, as the person who reminded me what it feels like to be seen." The parking garage was empty except for them. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. "Lily's been asking about you," Marcus said slowly. Claire blinked. She wants to know why she hasn't met my friend Claire yet. I'm running out of excuses." A smile broke across her face. "What kind of excuses?" "The kind that collapse under 9-year-old cross-examination." He stepped closer. "Maybe it's time to stop making them." "Maybe it is." They stood there at the empty garage, 2 people who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances and chosen each other through something much harder to define. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that somehow seemed softer in the space between them. Outside, somewhere beyond the concrete walls, the city continued its evening routine, cars honking, people hurrying home to families and dinners, and the ordinary moments that made up a life. But in this moment, in this unlikely place, something shifted between them. "Fair warning," Marcus said, his voice lighter than it had been in years. "Lily's intense about her robotics projects. She'll try to recruit you within 5 minutes of meeting you. I look forward to it. And I still have questions about trust and power and keeping this honest, about how 2 people from such different worlds make something real. I would expect nothing less from you. Those questions are why I trust you." He reached out and took her hand. A small gesture, barely more than a touch, but it held everything neither of them had been ready to say for the past year, and every conversation that had circled around this moment, without quite landing every glance that had lingered a moment too long. "Come to dinner," he said, "Saturday. Nothing fancy, just homemade spaghetti and a 9-year-old who will absolutely interrogate you about your intentions toward her father." Claire laughed, and the sound echoed through the empty garage like music, like promise, like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. "I accept on one condition." "What's that?" "We split the bill." Marcus smiled, really smiled, the first genuine, unreserved smile he'd allowed himself. In what felt like a lifetime, not since Emily, not since before the diagnosis, before the funeral, before he'd learned to be both mother and father to a little girl who just wanted her daddy to be happy. Deal.